Hi, I'm Dr. Rod Shaw of Math Plus Academy, and this math treat is called Grid Power. As you can see over here, I have a board. It looks like a chessboard or a checkerboard. It is an 8 by 8 grid of squares. And a natural question that we could ask is, how many squares are on this chessboard? Now you might say, well, that's pretty easy. I mean, there's 8 rows. Now you might say, that's pretty easy. There's 8 rows and 8 columns. 8 times 8 is 64. And you would certainly be right. There are 64 of those little squares floating around in that grid. But if we look for more squares, people will often notice that the whole thing is also a square. So doesn't that make 65 squares? And once you notice that, you might notice that there are squares of all different sizes hiding inside that chessboard. So that is my challenge for you this time. How many total squares are there of all the different sizes embedded in that chessboard? If you figure that out, then I have 3 really interesting extra problems for you to think about. One is, what if I gave you a 9 by 9 grid of squares or a 10 by 10 grid of squares? Could you tell me how many squares in total there are in those? And then could you generalize it to any number? So if I just said, hey, what about a 20 by 20 grid? How many squares are in there? Could you come up with a formula, an equation, an expression, something that would allow you to just quickly compute that number? So that's your first extra challenge. Another extra challenge could be, we've limited ourselves to thinking about squares, but what if we thought about rectangles? How many different rectangles can you find inside of this grid? That's also an interesting question to explore. And then lastly, we don't even have to confine ourselves to square grids. What about a triangular grid? How many triangles are embedded in this grid over here? And does that have any relation to my squares problem? Is it the same? Is it different? How is it different? How are they related? So many interesting questions for you to explore. So I'd love for you to do that. Start with the original problem, how many squares are in the chessboard, then try and extend it in any of those directions that you want, whatever you think is the most interesting. And as always, I just want you to have fun playing with the math.